In this week's edition of CivilNet's Business Digest, we take a look at Armenia's unprecedented GDP growth last year and the country's soaring trade with the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. We also look at the Armenian government's surprise decision this week to revive the long-stalled Amulsar gold mine project. Armenia's gross domestic product hit an all-time high of more than $21 billion last year, according to preliminary data published earlier this week by the state-run statistical committee. That figure represents a year-on-year growth rate of 12.6%, the highest annual expansion rate Armenia has recorded since independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Much of the growth was driven by booms in finance, information technology, and transportation, with all three sectors growing by over 45% in 2022. Hospitality, construction, wholesale and retail trade, and manufacturing all expanded by double-digit figures as well. The United Nations name-checked Armenia in a major report last month as an economy that has, quote, performed significantly better than foreseen amid an inflow of people from the Russian Federation and the relocation of Russian businesses. Banks in Armenia recorded an unprecedented net inflow of about $2.5 billion last year, according to central bank data, with over 70% of the transfers coming from Russia alone. About 65,000 Russians have moved to Armenia since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, figures from Armenia's Migration and Citizenship Service suggest. Earlier this month, Fitch upgraded the Armenian government's credit outlook to positive from stable, citing the influx of Russians to the country. Quote, Fitch anticipates that a substantial proportion of the new immigrants will stay in Armenia for at least 2 to 3 years, the rating agency said. As a result of last year's growth, Armenia's GDP per capita now tops $7,200, the highest figure the country has ever recorded. Armenia's exports to countries in the Eurasian Economic Union, a Russian-led trade bloc, nearly tripled last year, reaching about $1.6 billion, according to data compiled this week by the Eurasian Development Bank in Kazakhstan. That means that exports to Eurasian Economic Union countries accounted for nearly half of Armenia's total exports in 2022. In sharp contrast, less than one-third of Armenia's exports went to the bloc the year before. The Eurasian Economic Union is a free trade bloc that unites Armenia with 4 other former Soviet countries in an integrated single market: Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Overall, trade among Eurasian Economic Union countries topped $80 billion last year, the highest figure since the bloc's founding a decade ago. That represents a year-on-year increase of more than 10%. Experts say much of the growth in trade can be attributed to countries importing and then re-exporting products to Russia, which has seen an unprecedented number of sanctions imposed against it in response to the war in Ukraine. However, it remains unclear exactly how much of the trade growth is due solely to re-exports. Russian President Vladimir Putin pledged last month to, quote, do everything possible to further deepen integration in all areas among Eurasian Economic Union countries. In a surprise move, the Armenian government signed a $250 million agreement this week with the mining company Lydian Armenia, greenlighting operations at the long-stalled Amulsar gold mine. In return, Lydian ceded 12.5% of its shares in the mine to the Armenian government. Lydian broke ground at Amulsar in 2016, but development was indefinitely suspended 2 years later when environmental activists and residents of nearby communities began staging blockades of the mine entrance. They raised concerns about acid drainage from the project into nearby rivers and the planned use of highly toxic chemicals at the site. After years of delay, the Armenian government is now moving forward with the controversial project. Government officials say they expect Amulsar to grow Armenia's GDP by about 1%, while Lydian argues that the mine will contribute hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes to Armenia's state coffers over a decade of planned operations. Neither Lydian nor the Armenian government have given any dates for the planned start of operations at Amulsar. An environmentalist group called Amulsar Without a Mine pledged this week to, quote, reactivate our resources to oppose the project and said it would publish an action plan in the coming days. Lydian is ultimately owned by 2 equity firms specializing in mining, one in the United States and the other in Canada.